When my husband told me he needed to move in with his coworker just temporarily, just to help her through a difficult time, I looked at him across the kitchen table, nodded slowly, and said, "Of course. Let me help you pack." He blinked. I don't think he expected that. I folded his shirts the way I always had, the way my mother taught me, with the collars pressed flat and the sleeves tucked neatly underneath. I lined his toiletries into the travel bag he used for work trips. I even made sure he had enough of his blood pressure medication to last 2 weeks. Then I drove him the 40 minutes to her condo in Mississauga, watched him carry his bags to the lobby, and drove home alone on the 401 with the radio off. What I slipped into her mailbox 3 days later brought him back to our front door with nothing. Not an apology. Not even his dignity. I need to back up. My husband and I had been married for 11 years. We met at a company barbecue in Oakville. He was in project management, I was doing contract accounting work for the same firm. We weren't coworkers for long. I moved to a different company within the year, and we got married the following spring at a small venue outside Burlington with 60 guests and his mother crying through the entire ceremony. His name is not something I'll say here. I'll just call him my husband, because that is what he was. And honestly, that title feels like the most accurate description of the role he played in my life for over a decade. Not a partner, not in the end, but a husband in the technical sense. Present. Accounted for. Physically there. Her name doesn't matter either. I'll call her the coworker. She had joined his firm about 2 years before any of this happened. She was going through a separation, or so the story went. Her and her ex-husband had split. The apartment lease was complicated. She was staying with a friend temporarily. My husband mentioned her casually, at first the way you mention anyone from work. She said something funny at the team meeting. She recommended a good Thai place near the office. He had to cover for her on a project while she dealt with her separation paperwork. I didn't think much of it. I was busy. We were both busy. That's the honest truth of a long marriage, not that you stop caring, but that you stop noticing. You stop watching. The first thing I actually noticed was the joint account. We had a joint checking account for household expenses, mortgage payments, groceries, utilities, the usual. I checked it every 2 weeks or so when I was reconciling our personal budget, a habit from my accounting work that I'd never let go of. In October, I noticed a charge at a furniture store in Mississauga that I didn't recognize. Not enormous, just under $400, but I hadn't bought anything and neither purchase matched anything we'd discussed. I mentioned it to my husband that evening. He said it was a gift, a housewarming thing, because the coworker had finally found her own place and a few people from the office had chipped in together. He said it so easily, so reasonably, that I let it go. But I didn't stop noticing. A week later, there was a charge at a wine shop near his office. Then a dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to. On a Thursday night when he told me he was working late on a proposal. The amounts weren't huge. Nothing that would set off alarm bells on their own. But I was an accountant. Patterns were my entire professional language. I didn't say anything yet. I started keeping a separate record instead. November was when things shifted more visibly. He started coming home later. Not dramatically 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there. He started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, which he had never done before. He started folding laundry when I was in the other room, which sounds innocent but was unusual enough that I noticed. He had never once in 11 years voluntarily folded laundry. I kept a note on my phone. Dates, times, amounts, observations. Nothing accusatory. Just data. The conversation that broke everything open happened on a Tuesday in early December. He came home, sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a look I recognized from difficult conversations at work. The look of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and told me that the coworker was struggling more than expected with her transition. Her new apartment had issues. She was emotionally not in a good place. He felt responsible because he had been her main support at work and she didn't have family close by. He said he thought it would be best if he stayed with her for a few weeks to help her stabilize. He said I would understand once I met her, that she wasn't a threat, that this was just about being a decent human being during someone's hard time. I asked how long. He said 4 to 6 weeks, probably. I asked if her apartment had a guest room. He said it was a 1-bedroom, but he'd take the couch. I remember looking at the grain of the wooden table for a long moment. I had bought that table at an antique market in Hamilton the second year we were married. I had refinished it myself over a long weekend, with sandpaper and wood stain and my husband making coffee and handing me tools. It was a good table. I said, "Okay. Let me help you pack." I think he expected tears. Or an argument. Or at least a demand for more explanation. He got none of those things, and I could see it unsteadied him more than any of those reactions would have. While he was in the shower, I went into the small home office we shared and opened his laptop. I knew his password. We had always shared them, a point of trust we'd established early and never revisited. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was just checking. I found the email thread in about 4 minutes. It wasn't hidden. That's the thing. It was right there in his regular inbox, a long thread with her name, going back 8 months. I didn't read all of it. I read enough. I read the part where she asked if he thought I would ever agree to a separation. I read the part where he said he needed more time to figure out the finances. I read the part where she said she'd found a 1-bedroom near the GO station and asked if he wanted to be on the lease with her. He had said not yet. But the way he wrote it, not yet, not never. I closed the laptop. I went back to the kitchen. I finished making dinner. I need to explain something about what I did next, because I know how it sounds. I know that the obvious move, the emotionally satisfying move, would have been to confront him right there, to lay the printed emails on the table, to throw him out without a suitcase. I understand why that would feel like justice. But I had been doing accounting for 15 years. I understood that the most costly mistakes come from acting before you have the full picture. And I did not yet have the full picture. I had a thread of emails. I did not yet know what he had done with our finances. I did not know if his name was on her lease. I did not know if there were joint accounts I didn't know about. I did not know what he had been telling people, our friends, his family, my family. I did not know what story was already being built around me without my knowledge. So I packed his bags. I drove him to Mississauga. I hugged him in the lobby of her building while she watched from the elevator bay, and I said, "Take care of yourself." He looked at me with something I can only describe as guilty relief. The particular expression of someone who got exactly what they wanted and feels worse for it. I drove home and sat in our driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Then I got to work. The first call I made was to a family lawyer I'd researched 2 weeks earlier, a woman with a firm in downtown Hamilton who came recommended by a colleague of mine who'd been through a difficult divorce a few years back. I didn't have an appointment. I left a message and she called back within the hour. I explained the situation as factually as I could, the way I'd explain a discrepancy in a balance sheet. She told me what I needed to gather. Financial statements for the past 2 years. Any property documentation. Pension information. The mortgage. Our RSP records. Any accounts in both our names and any accounts I suspected might exist in his name only. I spent that evening pulling everything together from our shared files. I was systematic. I worked until past midnight. What I found over the next 2 days was more than I expected. There was a TFSA in his name alone that I had known about. We'd agreed years ago to each maintain individual accounts alongside the joint one. Nothing unusual there. But when I cross-referenced the statements I found, I realized he had been moving money from our joint savings account into that TFSA over the past 8 months. Small transfers. Irregular intervals. Nothing that would trigger a flag, but laid out in a spreadsheet with dates and amounts, unmistakably intentional. Over 8 months, he had quietly moved just over $14,000. In Ontario, that kind of financial conduct during a marriage, particularly if it can be demonstrated to be in preparation for separation, has consequences in equalization proceedings. My lawyer was very clear about that. I also found something I hadn't been looking for. In a folder on our shared home drive, a folder labeled with a project name from his firm, which is why I'd never clicked on it. I found a scanned document. It was a lease agreement. Her name. His name. The Mississauga address. Signed 4 months ago. He had been planning this for 4 months. The coworker's difficult transition and emotional instability and no family nearby, all of it had been the scaffolding built around a plan that was already in motion. I printed the lease. I printed the financial transfer records. I put them in a folder and dropped them at my lawyer's office the next morning. Then I thought about her. This is the part that surprises people when I tell this story. It surprised me too. I didn't know the coworker. I had no relationship with her. She was, in some ways, the obvious target of everything I was feeling, the person who had entered our marriage and taken something It would have been easy to aim everything I was doing in her direction. But I kept thinking about a specific line in those emails. The line where my husband had written, in response to a question she'd asked about our marriage, that things between us had been bad for years, that I was cold and difficult, that he had tried everything and I had refused to engage. That was not true. I had not refused to engage. I had been, by any measure, an attentive and present wife. We had never been to couples counseling, not because I'd refused, but because he had never suggested it. We had not had significant conflict. We did not have a marriage in crisis. We had a marriage that had become routine, which is a different thing entirely. She had made her decision based on information that was not accurate. She believed she was helping someone escape an unhappy situation. And she was about to sign a lease and begin a life with someone who had just described me, his wife of 11 years, as cold and difficult in order to justify what he was doing. I thought she deserved to know. I didn't send her a message. I didn't knock on her door. I didn't call her workplace. I wrote a letter. I kept it short, 2 pages. I didn't write it with anger. I wrote it the way I would write a difficult but important memo at work. I told her that I was the wife. I told her I had found the lease. I told her what the emails actually said about me and what they did not say, which was the truth. I attached a brief timeline of our marriage, not dramatic, just factual. 11 years, no separation, no indication of deep unhappiness that I had ever been made aware of. I included, without editorial comment, copies of the financial transfer records. The $14,000 quietly moved over 8 months, the timing of which lined up almost exactly with when her name first appeared in his inbox. I told her I was not writing to fight for my husband. I told her she was an adult who could make her own choices. I told her I simply thought she should have accurate information before she made them. I sealed it in an envelope. I drove to Mississauga on a Thursday morning. I found the building. I found the mailbox panel in the lobby, her unit number, and I slipped the letter through. I drove back to Hamilton and went to work. The call came 2 days later. It was a Saturday. My husband's name appeared on my phone and I let it ring twice before answering. He was outside. I looked out the front window and saw his car in the driveway, both bags visible in the back seat. I let him in. I made tea not because I felt warm toward him, but because I needed something to do with my hands, and because what was about to happen deserved a degree of composure that I'd spent 3 weeks carefully building. He sat down. He looked like someone who had not slept. He told me that she had asked him to leave. He said she'd received a letter. He said she had confronted him about things in the letter. He said she told him she needed to think and that she didn't think he should be at the apartment while she did. He looked at me and asked if I had written it. I said yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked what I wanted. I told him I had already spoken to a lawyer. I told him about the financial transfers. I watched his face and I told him that my lawyer had advised me on what equalization would look like if we proceeded to separation. I told him I was not interested in a dramatic ending. I was interested in a fair one. He asked if we could try counseling. I told him I hadn't decided yet. I told him he could stay in the guest room while we both figured out what came next. I told him the joint accounts were now under review by my lawyer and that I expected full financial transparency going forward. I told him these were not requests. He nodded. He picked up his bags. He went down the hall to the guest room. I finished my tea. I want to be honest about how that felt, because I think people expect a particular kind of ending to a story like this: triumphant, conclusive, healed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in the specific way you feel after you've carried something very heavy for a long time and finally set it down. Not light. Just unburdened. I had not done what I did to win. I had done it because the alternative, acting on pure emotion, making decisions before I had the full picture, letting him control the narrative of our marriage, would have cost me more than the truth was worth. The transfers were addressed through our lawyers over the following weeks. My husband enrolled in individual therapy. We started couples counseling in January with a registered therapist in Burlington. I don't know yet what we are building. I don't know if we are rebuilding at all. That part of the story is still being written, and I've made my peace with not knowing the ending. What I know is this: I did not beg. I did not perform grief for his benefit. I did not give him the reaction that would have let him cast me as the difficult, cold woman from his emails. I packed his bags. I drove him there. I wrote one quiet letter. And I made sure, when he came home, that home was still mine.